The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, I have to admit that I have been dreading today's show for quite some time, years in fact, that we are going to be talking about the South African power company Eskom and the Chinese role in what is a hot stinking pile of a mess that is going on politically, in terms of power generation. And it's interesting because we just had a discussion a few weeks ago about the Lamu coal power plant, and it really brings up the point that power issues in Africa are at the heart of the entire development story. If you don't have a solid power generation plan, electricity plan, nothing else happens. And the debates that are going on across the continent are absolutely fascinating, and China in many ways is at the heart of these in terms of funding or saving or somehow being involved in them, and there's no dispute that China has a role in Eskom. Let me give a few points of background about Eskom, and then, Cobus, I'm really going to turn over this whole discussion to you because it is very, very complicated. Eskom is South Africa's beleaguered state-owned power utility. The company supplies almost all of the country's electricity, and it was forced to initiate earlier this year managed blackouts. And the utility has $30 billion in debt, and that raises the issue that Eskom now is simply too big to fail and too big to be able to save at the same time because it is not generating enough money from its output in order to offset the losses that it's generating. Now, let me just give a little bit of some background before we get started on what Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, and what he feels is going on. And he says there is no silver bullet to save Eskom. And a lot of people look to the Chinese as that silver bullet because a couple of years ago, there was a major deal put in place that was going to potentially bring billions of dollars from the China-Africa Development Fund into Eskom, but that never came about. So what we're going to listen to now, just as a setup, is the parliamentary reply session where questions were asked to Ramaphosa about his comments in this year's State of the Nation regarding Eskom, and here's what he had to say.
The unprecedented failure of Eskom's generating capacity over the last few days underlines the severity of the challenges the company faces and the urgency of measures that are needed to address them. For those who have doubted the extent of these challenges, this week's load shedding has provided a hugely damaging reality check. There is no single solution to the problems at Eskom. There just is no one silver bullet. Neither is restructuring, nor refinancing, nor cost-cutting, nor tariff increases, nor better plant maintenance on their own will have necessary effect. We need to pursue all of these measures and more simultaneously in a coordinated fashion and with purpose to turn the utility around.
To turn the utility around, that's what Ramaphosa is saying. It will not have a silver bullet. Cobus, China was in fact seen, as we mentioned, as a silver bullet. But what is your take on Eskom and the severity of the situation?
This is the worst. It's such a difficult situation because it touches on so many different things. So a few kind of explanatory notes. In the first place, when South Africans say load shedding, what they mean is rolling blackouts, scheduled according to suburb, usually for about 2 to 6 hours at a time. So you would actually look on a schedule and say, okay, my suburb is going to be dark from like 2 to 6 this afternoon, for example. It causes massive chaos right through the city. You're talking about kilometers and kilometers of traffic because all the traffic lights are out. Sometimes water pumping is affected. Sometimes the internet is affected. So it has this massive kind of rolling effect, kind of that hits the economy very, very hard. Keep in mind that South Africa obviously is a mining country. So both the mines and mineral processing plants take massive amounts of electricity. And in the past, South Africa has built a lot of its industrial capacity on giving very favorable electricity rates to companies. At the same time, because of apartheid, there's massive shortfalls in the consumer grid in South Africa. So large parts of rural South Africa has very little access to electricity. So there's massive political pressure to roll out electricity. There's massive industrial pressure to keep it stable for industry. And then at the same time, the utility has been hijacked by, especially during the Zuma era, by corrupt politicians. So there is an incredible amount of very murky deals that were signed by different kind of actors within this utility. So over the Zuma era, the debt carried by Eskom has increased almost 10 times. So there's now the situation where, if one loan payment is missed, that essentially puts the entire South African economy into jeopardy. And that is actually where China comes in, because late last year, there was a loan approved by China Development Bank that would loan 2.5 billion to Eskom. And at the time, it was it raised a lot of anxiety in South Africa around debt trap issues. So if people who've listened to us over the last few years will have heard several episodes where we talk about this narrative that China uses debt as a kind of form of leverage to take over assets. In the case of Eskom, I think a Chinese takeover is probably best case scenario rather than worst case scenario. So there was a lot of anxiety around whether China is going to use debt as a form of leverage in relation to Eskom. This year, the flip side of the story came out when I think that the China Development Bank realized how much corruption and how much all kinds of mismanagement there is in Eskom. And they actually delayed the payment of a $500 million tranche of this $2.5 billion loan to Eskom, which essentially almost wrecked the South African economy. Literally, the South African economy was in the balance for the time that it took Eskom to get an emergency covering loan from a South African bank to cover this shortfall. So what we're talking about is China being involved in these kind of massive loan payments, essentially to try and keep the ship afloat, even as South Africans are wondering how they're going to run an economy with no electricity.
So we wanted to get some deeper perspective on Eskom in order to be able to explain, kind of take what Cobus said and go one step further, in part because, again, we're talking about Africa's second largest economy. And really, in so many ways, if Africa's second largest economy can't power itself, that has implications for not just the African economy, but even beyond. So we're so happy to have the opportunity to speak with Professor Hartmut Winkler, who's a professor of physics at the University of Johannesburg, where he was until recently also the head of the physics department. He's been at the University of Johannesburg for 16 years and taught both physics and astrophysics, and he's also a specialist in solar power generation and is a regular commentator on South African energy issues. Professor Winkler, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, good afternoon. I'm happy to be part of this.
So we've laid out this buffet of a hot mess, as I talked about. It is complicated. It is multifaceted. It is about as serious as it gets in some ways, because if Eskom fails, not only do South Africans not get power, but it has potential ramifications across the entire economic system in Southern Africa. Talk to us a little bit about how you see this issue in terms of the big picture of the stakes that are involved here.
Eskom being having a monopoly on power supply in this country, and yes, this does date back to the days when, the apartheid era, when essentially this was considered a highly strategic part of the South African economy, what sort of keeps everything up and going. Unfortunately, this sort of mindset, this framework hasn't really been changed. You'll normally find in most other countries there'll be several options of how electricity is supplied, several suppliers, and you'll find a situation where quite often the generation of power is privatized. This we don't have here. If somebody does want to start some sort of a power generation project, even on a relatively small scale, they have to go through a rather complicated process involving a lot of red tape and involving a lot of approvals. So essentially, without Eskom, it's very difficult to power anything other than maybe the heaters in your own home. That has been quite a serious stumbling block, and it's for that reason that Eskom is seen as such a critical asset and such a critical part of the economy, because literally all energy supply goes through it. And yes, as you rightly say, South Africa is also integrated with a Southern African network. We're hearing at the moment that Zimbabwe is going through serious power cuts, what you termed as load shedding. And that was essentially because of the dire predicament that Eskom finds itself in, is that they've been told, look, you just simply need to recoup your expenses. Now, in the past, as a neighbor, Zimbabwe would have simply said, look, we haven't got the funds right now. Can we maybe pay you later, whatever? And this would have normally happened, but not right now. Because of the situation that Eskom finds itself in, they are insisting that Zimbabwe basically come up with a funding. And if they don't, they're going to cut down on the electricity supply, and this is what's happened in Zimbabwe.
To even add more complications onto the already big pile, there's two things to keep in mind. One is that Eskom is a very big employer, which means that any kind of talk about privatizing it, breaking it up, like reforming in some kind of way, brings you up against very powerful trade unions in South Africa, and the trade unions are a political alliance member with the ruling African National Congress. So it becomes a very complicated political problem to solve. Second problem is that because South Africa, of course, is massively impoverished, and there is a lot of kind of illegal connections to the power grid, and also a lot of people who use power but who simply can't pay for it. And many municipalities are in hock to Eskom and simply not paying billions of dollars worth of arrears. And it's almost impossible to force them to pay. So that kind of adds to the problem. Hartmut, can you talk us a little bit through what are some of the options that are on the table at the moment to try and fix some of this, and what are the different kind of chances of success?
Yes. Yes, as you point out, Eskom is a large employer, and they're employing it's of the order of 20-25% more people now than they were about 10 years ago, and yet the power produced and distributed is more or less the same. So the general feeling is that that would be the one place where Eskom could save a lot on its expenditure. But as you rightly pointed out, that has all sorts of implications, and it's very difficult at the moment in South Africa with its very high unemployment rate to go through with a large sort of retrenchment exercise. So whether that's going to happen or not, we'll have to see. Certainly the view is that something must be done about right now. We're simply getting less as much electricity with about 25% more of a workforce than one had before. But the plan was that Eskom should be split into three units. The one being generation, so that's all the coal, solar, nuclear power stations. The other one being transmission, so that's really the operation of the electricity grid, the power lines. And the third one was a distribution. Now, I think what's behind this is that the transmission part is considered as something which would be viewed as something favorable to invest in, because that system is still in a fairly good shape. if one looks at the other two, that's where the costs and problems come in. In the distribution, as you've pointed out, the customers are the municipalities. The municipalities often aren't paying. So as a result, on the distribution side, Eskom is losing funds. On the generation side, we're dealing with these aging coal power stations and the requirement to build something new. And there again, especially the maintenance of the old power stations is something that probably it's going to be difficult to find investors in it. So I think the idea is really to put the two problem children on the one side and sort of somehow keep these going and hope that the the transmission part, the grid, is going to see a large investment. And yes, whether that's going to happen or not, I'm not sure. Eskom is running out of options, because I think what will happen if we continue on the current track is that simply going to be forced to increase electricity tariffs even more. We're going to have more power outages. We're going to have more people moving off the grid, what's referred to as grid defection. And those are normally the people who can afford to pay. So we might get a situation where suburbs or factories or shopping malls are simply going to be developing their own internal electricity system. And the rest is in set up for eventual failure. So, yes, where we are right now, we don't know. We've certainly internally, Eskom has had difficulties. The last chief executive officer, has resigned. I think he just saw the magnitude of the task more than he could handle. Eskom is currently looking for a replacement, but it's certainly not the kind of position which is going to be viewed as attractive to most of the top potential top executives around.
Yeah, Hartmut, when we talk about the investors and the breaking off of the into three separate divisions, given the scale of what's needed to be done and the amount of money that's needed to come in to salvage this company, even if it's just 1/3 of it, that is the healthy part of it, the volume is huge of what needs to be done. So when we look at who is a potential investor to do this, it won't be the Europeans or the Americans. It may be some Eurobonds. I mean, at this point, I think Eskom has about $5.5 billion in outstanding Eurobond debt. But that's a very expensive form of debt. So at the end of the day, maybe I'm wrong here, but the only kind of group that sits out there with this kind of cash that would be able to make an investment that would move the needle on Eskom are the Chinese.
Very much so.
And for a long time, the Chinese have been in discussions. The China Development Bank has been in discussions, but China now is starting to be a little bit more discriminating in the types of investments that it makes. So 2 or 3 years ago, when Cobus mentioned that the China Development Bank had opened up a $2.5 million line of investment for Eskom, today things have changed a little bit. And I'm wondering if, what your take on the role of the Chinese is as a potential, I don't want to say savior, because as President Ramaphosa said, there are no silver bullets here, but as a major player in the restructuring of Eskom, do you analysts in South Africa look to the Chinese to do something like this?
Yes, as you say, if it's not going to be the Chinese, then I'm not quite sure who. India perhaps, but India wouldn't be able to make the investment on the sort of scale that the Chinese are able to. So it certainly that would be the one angle that people in this country would be looking towards. There is in the question, of course, nobody is going to invest without hope of some sort of return. So there's a question of what these returns might look like. Is it simply going to be part of an expansion of Chinese trade in general in the Southern African region, or there's something else that might go with it? I mean, the Chinese have also been quite key in, for example, if one looks at the solar energy market. I mean, most of the solar panels come from there, so and there's certainly a lot of scope to increase renewable energies in South Africa. So that could be part of that sort of general initiative. The Chinese were also one of the countries that were interested in building a new nuclear plant in South Africa. But I'm willing to put my head down that that's just simply not going to happen anymore. I think that the nuclear project is Well, it was handled very badly at the time 5 years ago, and I cannot see this recovering. So I think the way the country is going to go, they're probably going to go into renewables on a fairly large scale, but at the same time, I mean, right now, South Africa gets something like 90% of its electricity is from coal, which is massive. There's not many other countries in the world which do that. And so I foresee that in 20 years' time or so, while we're going to have quite a significant growth of renewables, I suspect the country is still largely going to be dependent on coal.
Well, if we can unpack that a little bit, the climate impact of this is horrifying. And then there's recently been studies coming out that in some South African cities around some of these Eskom coal-fired plants, the air quality is worse than in Jakarta or Beijing. So some of the places that are seen as having the worst air in the world. Obviously this is having a massive public health effect as well, and not only a climate effect. What would it take, as you mentioned, China is both a big manufacturer of solar energy and has done some significant solar installations in Africa as well. What will it take? What kind of costs are we looking at getting the country onto solar power, or to at least make a dent in the amount of generation via solar power in South Africa?
Yes, well, as I see no reason why the country wouldn't be able to produce something like half of its electricity from renewables. At the moment, wind is expected to have a slightly bigger slice than solar, but wind pumps are also really can be manufactured in China. So certainly, on that level, there could be quite a lot of investment in the field. There is also the question of potential new coal power stations. And there has been a story about a Chinese-driven project in the northern parts of South Africa in a coal field that's yet to be developed. I've always been a little bit skeptical about whether this is actually going to happen. It certainly runs against the world grain, where at the moment everybody is really trying to close down whatever power capacity they have. So I think it would be very difficult to start something like this off without a major controversy. And as I said, South Africa already has such a lot of coal power plants. I don't see this project really taking off the ground. So I think that it's possible that the developers have sort of come to realize that this is not going to be quite easy. Initially, there was talk that this plant the construction was going to be starting basically now. I haven't heard anything else of it. I suspect that's going to be put more on the back burner. If something was firmly arranged there, it wasn't done via the normal process. The way South Africa operates is that it has these electricity plans which get developed. And so at the moment, there is no provision for building coal power stations on that sort of scale. So in essence, it's not following the process that is required. And even after that, you've got to then get a permission from the National Electricity Regulator and so on. So at the moment, all we're seeing as far as coal is concerned, there are these two very large plants, Medupi and Kusile, which were supposed to have been finished ages ago, but we aren't. So it's likely that those will be finished. And then there's a question still whether there's going to be one or two medium-sized plants run by independent power producers. Those are looking increasingly less likely. So I suspect that what's going to happen with regards to coal is that apart from this Medupi and Kusile, which are still relatively new, I think the old plants are going to be kept going as far as is feasible, but after they simply cannot prove not to be probably productive anymore, they're just going to be retired one after the other. And this question of the air pollution is quite serious because, right now, one of the biggest plants, Kendal, is at the moment, its anti-pollution control mechanisms are not working. So at the moment, the air that the smoke that it's billowing out of there is way above accepted levels, and Eskom simply saying, sorry, but we don't have the money to fix this.
Wow, this is far more depressing than I initially thought that the story was.
Than even you imagined, yeah.
No, really. I mean, it is just tragic on so many different levels. Hartmut, let's just kind of step back a little bit and summarize some of the key points that you've made over this discussion. Number one is the fact that we're not going to get out of this problem with solar or renewable energy. It simply will take too long. The investments aren't there. The infrastructure isn't there. That's not going to solve the Eskom problem. The breakup of Eskom into 3 units and finding investors, that's the silver bullet that Ramaphosa is talking about in terms of who is going to actually come in and invest in this. That is hard to see right now. So you've left us off at the doorstep of where I thought you might, which is, on a cliff. What is going to happen in the next 5 years? Where do we see South Africans going if they don't have a power supply system that is both healthy? I mean, we're talking about choking off enormous numbers of people with heavy pollutants. And Cobus, you mentioned something very interesting in our pre-show discussion, that South Africa exports its highest quality coal to China, Japan, and Korea and keeps the dirtiest for itself. So not only are the filters not working, but it's the filters on the dirtiest coal that's not working. So again, peel back the layers of this onion and it's rotten on the inside. So Hartmut, tell us where we're going to be in the next 5 years.
Yes, well, paradoxically, one thing which is helping Eskom quite a lot is that the anticipated power demand growth is not as high as expected. Now, some people would say, oh, that's a symptom that the economy is not going so well. But I think it goes beyond that. Internationally, the trend is that you don't necessarily get a linear kind of growth in electricity. Once you reach a certain level, it tends to sort of flatten off. And in some countries, it's even starting to go down a bit. This has got partly to do with various electricity saving mechanisms. I mean, things like the introduction of LEDs and so on. So that I think the broader public is much more aware of the need to actually save on electricity. I think it was also prompted by the increased cost of electricity. Electricity in South Africa used to be exceptionally cheap, but not anymore. So what has been happening is that if one looks at where people thought electricity demand was going to be 10 years ago compared to where it actually is, it's quite a lot lower. So and every time projections get revised, there's a tendency to decrease the anticipated requirements. So the situation is not quite as so bad that one, that we did. It's certainly helping that the need for building new plants is not quite as large as people projected. So right now it's really a situation of seeing how does one manage to keep the existing coal plants going, and some of them you simply cannot keep going for much longer. Apart from the pollution, if it's just the maintenance is just becoming more and more expensive, and how quickly can one introduce solar and wind power to somehow mitigate against that? There have always been hopes that South Africa and Africa in general could be saved by damming up the Congo River. There's a project known as Grand Inga. I mean, if it ever did come about, it would certainly make a massive change in electricity supply in Africa. But again, that project, I don't know if it's going to happen. It's been delayed. So people here aren't really counting on that. So ultimately, I see a situation where I think that the crisis as such, it certainly was bad this year, but that was partly as a result of too many plants being off for maintenance or breakages at the same time. There was even some possible talk of sabotage or so. I don't really think that it was that, but it's now, for example, this is the middle of winter in South Africa, and this is usually when demand is at its highest. And at the moment, the plants are coping, even though some probably shouldn't be operational right now. So to what extent are things going to grow and what extra capacity is coming online? Well, slowly the Medupi and Kusile units that aren't functional yet are probably going to come online in the next 5 years or so. And gradually, at the moment, something of the order of 2 gigawatts worth of renewable energy plants are being built. So that will all help. But of course, renewables have got this problem that they depend on the weather and depend on the day-night cycle. So, yes, that's right. So ultimately, right now, unless there's some big developments regarding storage of electricity, there's only renewables can only really play some sort of a support role. They're not going to be able to run the country by themselves.
Okay, well, that's a slightly upbeat way of looking at it and a good place for us to end. Professor Hartmut-Winkler, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and to help explain what has been a very intimidating issue for me, but you actually did make it a little bit more digestible and understandable, and even found some glimmer of optimism, which I didn't think was possible in all of it. Professor Hartmut-Winkler is at the University of Johannesburg in the physics department and an expert in renewable and solar power generation, as well as a regular commentator on South African energy issues. Hartmut, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Because throughout the discussion with Professor Winkler, all I could think about was Kenya. I mean, just like, wow, 2 totally different stories that are going on here. Through the coal decision by the Lamu coal plant verdict that came down from the Kenyan Environmental Tribunal earlier this year, it really opened up how Kenya, in so many ways, is doing a lot of things right. Getting a lot of the electricity from renewables, geothermal, hydro, solar, now wind. A 305 megawatt plant was just opened for wind power. So the energy mix in Kenya, sure, the politics are dysfunctional and corrupt and there are problems throughout. Everybody acknowledges that. But generally speaking, they're going in the right direction. They're adding capacity. They're adding renewable capacity.
Yeah.
And they're pushing back on the Chinese when things need to be pushed back on. So that $1.2 billion loan from the International Commercial Bank of China that was to fund the coal power plant in Lamu was rejected. And what did the Chinese ambassador to Kenya do after that verdict? He welcomed all the plaintiffs to come and say, let's figure something else out. So the Chinese, in many ways, are playing a very constructive role in the Kenyan energy mix. Here in South Africa, wow, what a different story. It is a mix. The Chinese seem to be, according to my reading, and I might be misreading this, stepping back and saying, you know what, we need you guys to figure this thing out before we're going to get involved in this. The word of the day in the Chinese policy banks is feasibility. And if projects do not have feasibility and are not feasible for a path to return on investment, they are not going to get funded. And right now, Eskom does not look like it has such a path.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, it's, one of the things that Cyril Ramaphosa came in on, when the ANC won the election this year, was that he's going to have a plan on Eskom. And so far, as he himself pointed out, kind of one single plan isn't going to do it. You're going to need several of them, and they're going to have to come fast and they have to work. I think South Africa is running out of time. And I think there's a lot there that China can help with, particularly in relation to renewable energy. I mean, China is a world leader on renewable energy. But I think at the moment, it's also that South Africa has been in a coal mindset for a long time. A lot of people in the government come from mining. A lot of, the logic of we have this mineral and we need to use it is very, very entrenched, in African development thinking. So there is a little bit of a, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of problem, in this. And there's also this tendency to try and to downplay any kind of concern about climate change as first world problems, quote unquote, or first world concerns, even though everyone knows that Africa will be hit particularly hard through climate change, and that Cape Town itself has run out of water last year because of climate change. So there's a lot of extremely pressing problems and not a lot of very inspired leadership, and I think that really is a big part of the problem.
Well, it wasn't just Cape Town that was running out of water. I mean, it looked to be the whole country was actually starting to run low on water.
Yes.
So in so many ways, South Africa is on the front line of climate change. And the fact that they're belching out so much CO2 from coal is really distressing. And at the same time, I think we can't avoid the politics, the global geopolitics on this, that the United States administration, the Trump administration, is a strong advocate of coal and has been promoting coal. And in so many ways, if this is in fact the case, where is the U.S. administration in advising Eskom if the Americans are so big on coal as Trump is? At least there might be some advice coming in from the White House on this, which I haven't seen any outreach from the Ramaphosa government to the U.S. administration for any type of support on trying to turn Eskom around, which I think is notable in that sense, given the fact that Trump is such a big advocate of, and his administration and his ambassadors as well, particularly in Kenya, are big advocates of coal. So you would think there would be an alignment of interest there.
Yes, and keep in mind that the coal that was supposed to be used in the Lamu plant in Kenya was supposed to come from South Africa. So there's all of this pressure for South Africa to also export coal, and then at the same time, as coal gets less and less sexy in China, there's also this pressure on Chinese companies to export to their coal plant building capacities elsewhere in the world along the Belt and Road. So neither China nor the US is actually looking amazing, in terms of dealing with this issue. This providing renewable energy in Africa could potentially, in theory, be a fantastic space for collaboration between the US and China, because they both bring such kind of massive capability and technological know-how to this issue. But political will is something else.
Yeah. So we hope that we've been able to bring you a little bit of an understanding on the Eskom issue, which, as you hopefully took away from our discussion, is absolutely critical for the entire future of the Southern African region. I mean, this is, again, too big to fail, not just for South Africa, but for all of Southern Africa. Not to mention the climate implications of a company belching out as much coal and CO2, emissions as these guys are. So there are ramifications across the board, politically, economically, environmentally, on this Eskom deal and this salvage of Eskom. Can Ramaphosa do it? It's not entirely clear. Everybody thinks there's going to be a happy ending at some point and they're going to figure this thing out. Maybe not. And that's something we all have to take into account, because if this thing goes down, it's going to bring a lot with it. So it's definitely something that we are going to try and keep an eye on. I am intimidated by this topic, to be honest with you, because of the complexity. I will not shy away from admitting that. It is really scary as a topic. But it is something that we will be more committed over the next 6 to 9 months to look at before the end of the year again, and kind of keep you informed as well. But we really recommend that you kind of start to pay attention to this because of the broader ramifications and the links to China, which are quite strong in as a subtext of the entire story. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Hey, if you want to get in touch with Cobus or I, you can email us directly, cobus@chinaafricaproject.com. You can email me at Eric, ERIC, @chinaafricaproject.com. We reply to every single email. So that is really remarkable, but we do. And we would love to hear from you. If you've got questions, if you've got ideas, if you've got criticisms, please share us. Tell us, you think we're wrong. You think we're not doing it the right way. We love to hear that kind of feedback, as long as it's civil. Keep it polite. And then, of course, if you want to sign up for our newsletter, it goes out every Friday now. We've switched it from Mondays to Fridays. It's a week in review. Cobus is writing these great little summaries at the top, and we're putting together all the top stories of the week. You don't want to miss this email. It is fantastic. We're really proud of it, and really a great tool to go into your weekend as to some of the reading you may not have caught up on over the course of the week. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus @Stadinsky or Eric @EOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.chinaafricaproject.com.